Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to take the sources you provide, articles, videos, notes, and really boil them down for you.
Yeah, get to the core insights, those aha moments without, all the extra noise.
Exactly. You're here because you want that deep understanding, but you also want it efficiently.
Today, we're diving into something pretty fascinating. The views of theoretical physicist Brian Greene.
Specifically, how he talks about science and religion. It's often compared or contrasted with figures like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins.
Right. We've got some YouTube transcripts, Greene talking with Harris, Greene with Dawkins, and also some analysis from Jorge Pires' PhD on Medium.
Our mission, then, is to unpack the nuances in Greene's thinking here. What does his approach tell us about belief today?
And honestly, there are some moments that make you go, some apparent contradictions when you look closely at Greene's own experiences.
Definitely some head-scratching moments.
Well,
Okay, let's jump right into one of those.
Perfect. So Brian Greene, obviously a major scientific figure, tells this story. It's incredibly human, actually.
What happened?
His mother wasn't answering her phone, and he got worried, naturally.
Okay.
And in that moment of anxiety, what does he do? He's an atheist, remember. He prayed.
He prayed, really?
Yep, he even calls it a totally irrational thing. And sort of joked it was like hedging my bets.
Wow.
Yeah,
It immediately raises questions, doesn't it? How can someone so, rigorously scientific have that kind of impulse?
It's almost like a reflex, isn't it?
Right.
Something deep-seated kicks in.
Yeah. It actually reminds me, didn't Richard Dawkins admit something similar about, feeling uneasy in a haunted house?
He did, in that same conversation with Greene, I think. Intellectually, no ghosts, but emotionally, still a flicker of something.
So, okay, Greene has this irrational moment. What do we make of that? How does the analysis we looked at frame it?
Well, this is where Jorge Pires' take is really interesting. He doesn't just see it as a quirky anecdote. No, he calls it a paradox, even a philosophical impasse. And what strikes Pires is how Greene seems to just accept it. With a shrug, as Pires puts it.
Like it's no big deal.
Sort of. Greene himself suggests that maybe irrational ideas can be useful sometimes in certain moments.
Okay. Useful for comfort, maybe?
Exactly. But Pires really challenges that idea. He basically says, look, usefulness doesn't make something true. It doesn't justify the belief itself.
That's a strong point.
Yeah, he uses this great analogy comparing Greene's God in that moment to a panic button or maybe a teddy bear.
A comfort object.
Right. Comforting, sure, but not really about genuine belief or conviction. It makes you wonder, if we start justifying beliefs just because they feel useful, where does that leave the search for, actual truth?
That's a really critical question. Utility as a justification. Yeah, that could open the door to almost anything, couldn't it? Comforting, maybe, but not necessarily grounded.
It does feel like Greene is drawing a bit of a line there between his scientific framework and these very human emotional reactions.
Okay, so let's shift gears slightly. There's another angle in the sources, the different ways Greene and Sam Harris approach talking about science and religion.
Ah, yes. Their communication strategies. Very different.
Greene seems to really lean towards inspiring people, right? Getting them excited about science itself.
Absolutely. He has that quote, something like, going out into the world and telling people they're stupid for certain beliefs strikes me as not the best strategy.
Yeah, I remember that.
His focus is clearly on building passion and enthusiasm. He thinks that will naturally lead people towards science, maybe away from less rational views, but without direct confrontation.
Whereas Sam Harris, well, he's known for being much more direct, confrontational even.
Definitely. Harris often frames it as a zero-sum contest, at least in certain areas, between religion and science.
Meaning they can't both be right.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
His worry is that if you put, say, cosmology up against a religious belief about the universe's origin, a lot of people will just stick with faith.
So Harris thinks scientists need to actively challenge those beliefs.
He does. He sees some religious beliefs as actively harmful, impeding rational thought. So for him, it's a kind of responsibility to critique them directly.
Okay, so this really points to different goals, doesn't it?
Fundamentally different. Harris wants to dismantle the bad reasons people have for believing things. He's aiming for a widespread rejection of unfounded beliefs.
And Greene.
Greene seems more focused on increasing scientific literacy overall, hoping that understanding science deeply will maybe gently erode certain conflicting beliefs over time. But the priority isn't the direct attack.
It's interesting, though, because Harris does mention, doesn't he, that sometimes reasoning does work. that people can change their minds based on argument.
Yeah, he shares anecdotes about that. He seems a bit more optimistic, perhaps, that direct logical engagement can sometimes break through, even with deeply held beliefs.
But Greene's concern is that backfire effect, right? The idea that attacking someone's core beliefs just makes them dig their heels in deeper.
Exactly. It's a classic communication problem. How do you promote critical thinking in science without just shutting people down or making them defensive, especially when faith is involved?
So this connects to another point raised in the sources about Greene's specific field.
Right. Theoretical physics. String theory.
He mentions to Harris, I think, that he doesn't often run into the direct conflicts that Harris is talking about, like where specific religious beliefs clash with policy on, say, climate change or medicine.
Yeah, he suggests that maybe his field is a bit removed from the front lines, unlike, say, evolutionary biology, which directly challenges creationist narratives. Physics, especially theoretical stuff like string theory, might seem more abstract, less immediately threatening to certain worldviews.
Is that really the case? Is physics totally off the hook?
Well, that's where Pires pushes back again. He argues that no, physics isn't immune at all.
How so?
He uses the fine-tuning argument as an example. You know, the idea that the universe's physical constants seem so perfectly set up for life that it must imply a designer.
Ah, right. That's a direct engagement with physics, trying to find space for God within it.
Precisely. It's a religious argument aimed squarely at physics, and Pires points out it's even used against concepts like string theory or the multiverse.
And he mentions Francis Collins, too, doesn't he, as someone trying to bridge science and faith.
Yes, a prominent geneticist who is also religious. Collins sometimes critiques ideas like the multiverse, potentially from a perspective influenced by his desire to harmonize science and faith. It shows the interaction is still very active.
So the battleground has maybe shifted. It's not just Galileo anymore.
Kind of. Pires calls it God of the Gaps 2.0. Instead of just pointing to things science can't explain yet, it's sometimes about leveraging scientific uncertainty itself, like the multiverse, to make theological points.
So even if Greene doesn't feel it day to day in his work, physics is still very much part of this broader conversation, this turf war, as Harris might put it.
Definitely. Which brings us back to Greene's own position, his seeming ambivalence, perhaps.
Right. This tension between his rigorous scientific mind and these personal, almost religious-seeming reactions like the prayer incident.
Could that have wider implications? Even if it's just, a personal coping thing for him. Could it subtly affect how science is viewed? Or even, could it potentially hold back progress in some way?
Or maybe even inadvertently give some legitimacy to ideas that conflict with science.
That's the kind of concern Pires raises. He floats this quite provocative idea. Could Greene potentially evolve into someone more like Francis Collins, where personal faith might start to maybe unconsciously shade scientific reasoning?
That's a serious point.
Pires is careful to distinguish, though. Is Greene's action, the prayer, just a superficial psychological relief? A momentary comfort? Or does it hint at something deeper, maybe a subconscious belief?
Because if it's just the first one, maybe it's not a huge deal in the grand scheme of things.
Perhaps not. But if it leans towards the second, well, there are potential issues.
Yeah, because Brian Greene has a huge platform. He's a major voice for science communication. People trust him.
Exactly. If someone with his intellectual authority were to genuinely embrace or seem to embrace religious belief later on, it could, maybe unintentionally, be used to validate faith-based views, even ones that clash with science.
It really shows how careful scientists, especially public figures, have to be when they talk about these things. It's such a sensitive area.
A real tightrope walk.
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe let's try and pull these threads together as we wrap up this deep dive.
Sounds good. We've really dug into this central tension with Brian Greene, haven't we?
Yeah. On one hand, his public stance is quite diplomatic. Inspire, don't attack. Focus on the wonder of science.
But then you have these personal moments like the prayer that seem, inconsistent with his stated atheism. It creates this kind of puzzle.
And we contrasted that with Sam Harris's much more direct, confrontational approach, the idea that you have to challenge irrationality head on.
And Jorge Pires' analysis provides that critical perspective, right? Questioning Greene's sort of detached acceptance of his own irrational moments and worrying about the potential long-term implications.
It just highlights how incredibly complex the whole science-religion interface is. There isn't one single way people navigate it. Greene's experience is just one very interesting example.
Absolutely. A really compelling case study.
Which leads us, I think, to a final thought for you, our listener.
Yeah, something to chew on.
Consider how much things like personal feelings, our upbringing, cultural baggage, how much of that stuff plays a role even in minds we think of as highly rational.
Like Greene's.
Exactly. Is it even possible, or maybe even desirable, to have a completely detached, purely logical approach when you're trying to communicate science, especially about these big, belief-laden topics?
Maybe think about your own life. Those moments where perhaps logic takes a backseat to emotion or habit or just something else. How do you make sense of those moments within your own worldview?
It's definitely something worth pondering long after you finish listening to us.